Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to our very special guest today, Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson. Welcome to our 5th Senators for Climate Solutions speaker event. Bienvenue, collègues. Thank you for coming, and merci pour votre intérêt. It is wonderful to see that we have members from all Senate groups confirmed to attend with us here today. That is what Senators for Climate Solutions is all about, trying to bring people from all groups in the Senate with different perspectives so that we can together learn and act to ensure climate action happens here in Canada. I'm speaking to you today from Antigonish, Nova Scotia in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq peoples. We have a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. I think you already know that Minister Wilkinson's remarks will be recorded, but we will not record the Q&A session. We want everybody to feel very open and comfortable at that time. Interpretation is provided. And for those who would like to ask questions following the minister's presentation, could you please keep in mind that you need your Senate headset for interpretation. In order to ask a question, please use the raised hand function if you have a headset. And if you are not, then please put your question in the chat and we'll do our best to accommodate. All right, Senators for Climate Solutions is very pleased to welcome you all to today's session with the Honourable Minister Wilkinson, Canada's Minister of Natural Resources. First elected as Member of Parliament for North Vancouver in 2015, Minister Wilkinson previously served as Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard. Raised in that wonderful province of Saskatchewan and a Rhodes Scholar, Minister Wilkinson spent more than 20 years in the private sector holding leadership positions with a number of green tech companies. Colleagues, Minister Wilkinson is well positioned to provide us with an update on Canada's recently released budget, the 2030 emissions reduction plan, the implications of that plan for Canada's Natural Resource Centre. He could speak to us of the recently approved Bay du Nord project. I'm not sure whether he will, but we can certainly ask him about that. And of course, that very important topic, global topic of the European energy security situation. So, and I'm sure there will be other things he will want to speak to us about, but those are a number of things that I'm sure people are anxious to hear about. Thank you, Minister, for agreeing to speak to our group today. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you, Minister Wilkinson.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you mentioned Saskatchewan because I was going to note that Senator Cotter and I actually worked together in Saskatchewan for the government of Saskatchewan when he was Deputy Minister of Justice, and I was working for a distinguished Premier Romano for a number of years. So always happy to see Senator Cotter. Mes assistants ont préparé quelques notes, mais je crois que c'est beaucoup mieux si je parle seulement et nous pouvons avoir une conversation. So I'm going to speak, je vais parler en anglais, mais je suis très content d'avoir les questions et de faire les réponses en français aussi. I'll just touch on a few things, starting with energy security. I talked just a little bit about the recent emissions reduction plan and some of the economic side of the climate approach. And then I will touch just briefly on Bay du Nord, because I'm sure that is something that will come up in the conversation. So I think folks will know, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and obviously some of the terrible things that we've seen happening there, there was a very significant focus on the energy transition. And that was certainly seen at COP26 with respect to progress that was made with respect to commitments that most countries around the world were making, getting to the point that if all those commitments were implemented fully, we would see a 1.8 degree centigrade rise. That's not 1.5, but it was significant progress in terms of actually moving from a scenario that was more like 2.5. And we've also seen, significant action, at least in some jurisdictions. Most particularly, you can see progress with respect to things like the deployment of zero-emission vehicles. Europe is ahead of Canada, but in many European countries, you are seeing enormous traction with respect to EVs, and we're actually seeing the beginnings of that here in Canada, especially in jurisdictions that have been progressive in this regard, like Quebec and British Columbia. Before I start, I just want to situate the whole discussion around 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the focus on a net zero scenario by 2050. And I think sometimes we have not been entirely clear about energy and what energy looks like in the context of a 1.5 degree scenario. Some people are of the view and do say this publicly that is the end of fossil fuels. And I would say to you, that's actually not true. That a 1.5 degree world is certainly a world where fossil fuel production is much lower than it is today, and that the combustion of fossil fuels has been largely eliminated. But in the IEA's 1.5 degree scenario, you will see that of the 100 million barrels of oil that are produced today, 25 million continue to exist in a 1.5 degree scenario. But they are used for things like petrochemicals, solvents, waxes, and a range of other things that are non-combustion related applications. Same thing is true with gas. In the 1.5 degree scenario that the IEA put out, 50% of the volume of gas that's produced today continues to be produced at 1.5 degrees at net zero by 2050. But it's not combusted. It's used in the production of things like hydrogen. And so, I think people actually need to be clear about some of these issues, because it's important in the context of what does this transition look like and what are the endpoints of the transition. The invasion of Ukraine has certainly raised the profile of the energy security issue. It is a very difficult situation in Europe. I will tell you, I've been speaking with my European colleagues. I was in Paris 2 weeks ago for the IEA meetings, meeting with a number of my colleagues. And when I met with the EU commissioner, I mean, she was virtually in tears. I mean, they are worried that they will not be able to have diesel to have trucks that drive groceries to the stores. They are worried that people will not have gas to be able to heat their homes. And so it is a very challenging situation in which they are asking for the help of their friends and allies around the world. There are, I think, in this country, as is often the case, kind of two poles in terms of people's response to Canada assisting Europe in this regard. There are those who say energy security is so important that we should forget about climate change. And there are others on the other side of it that say the climate issue is so critical, and any move to increase the fossil fuels that could go to Europe to displace Russian oil and gas are detrimental to the climate fight. We shouldn't do anything to help Europe. And I would say that both of these views, in my view, are displaced. Canada and other countries, but Canada in particular, should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We should be able to think about how we can assist our European friends and allies in a manner that is consistent with our climate commitments. And so the 300,000 barrels a day extra that I announced a couple of weeks ago is part of that. It is about displacing Russian oil and gas. The consumption emissions are zero because you are displacing Russian oil. And the production emissions are accounted for in the context of our climate plan. We essentially were pulling forward production that was already in the profile that was assumed in the context of the climate plan. And we are looking at potential opportunities with respect to liquid natural gas at the request of the Europeans. We have a working group that the EU and Canada announced a couple of weeks ago, the Prime Minister and President von der Leyen. We have a working group with Germany on exactly those issues as well. But they have to be fit within the overall context of the climate discussion. And so in the context, for example, of LNG, you would have to have very, very minimal production emissions. And that means you couldn't use natural gas to liquefy. You would actually have to use electric drive technology, which reduces very much any emissions associated with the production. You would have to have aggressive upstream emission reductions to ensure that you are minimizing the amount of emissions associated with the production of natural gas. And that certainly is something that Canada is leading the world on. We are the only country that has committed under the IEA's call to the 75% methane reductions by 2030. So I would just say to you, Canadians, I think, expect a thoughtful and balanced approach. I don't think most Canadians would say, let the Europeans freeze in the dark, nor would they say, well, we should just forget about climate change. And I think both of those positions are irresponsible from my perspective. In terms of the emissions reduction plan, it targeted all sectors of the economy. It is ambitious across the board. If you think about the transportation sector, we are now saying We will get to 60% of all new cars being sold in this country by 2026 will be zero emission vehicles, and 100% by 2030. That is ambitious. There is a lot of work to do to get there. In the same way, the oil and gas sector, many have said that perhaps it's overly ambitious, but it's sharing the burden, and we are going to have to work in terms of how to get them there. It is 30% below 2005, but it's 42% below where they were in 2019. So it's 8 years, and it's 42% emissions reductions that we're actually looking to do. And certainly we are going to have to collaborate and use all the tools in the toolbox that are going to enable us to get there, because we are essentially looking to reduce emissions at a time when global production of oil is not expected to decline until after 2030. We will start to see demand destruction for oil after 2030 as you see broader based deployment of zero emission vehicles. But between now and 2030, there's almost no forecast, including the IEA's net zero forecast, that sees significant declines in oil production. I would say that the opportunity side of climate change is something that we do need to focus on in this country, which is about how do you build an economy that will be prosperous and create jobs in all regions of this country in a future that's going to look different than the future today. My view is Canada is extremely well placed to take advantage of these opportunities for a whole range of different reasons. One of the things we will be launching within a month or so is what we are calling regional economic or regional energy tables, that essentially will look on a province by province basis, working with the provinces, industry, labor, and of course engaging Indigenous peoples, on the 3 or 4 big opportunities in that particular province that can move the needle from an economic perspective. And how do we actually align resources, permitting and regulatory processes, engagement with Indigenous peoples in a manner that will allow us to expedite development. So those will be different in Alberta versus Nova Scotia. In Alberta, it's probably going to be CCS and hydrogen, it's critical minerals, it's biofuels. Obviously, in Quebec, it's about hydroelectricity and hydrogen that's derived from electrolysis. It's batteries, and it's a range of other things. So these are essentially going to be place-based economic strategies that will also couple with the discussion around how do we ensure that there is sufficient electricity in this country going forward to be able to support all of that. You will have seen a bunch of things in the budget and in the emissions reduction plan that is funding around these things, $3 billion or $4 billion for critical minerals, a growth fund that is $15 billion that is intended to incent private capital, and a range of things around accelerating work in terms of zero emission deployment, around buildings, et cetera. And I'm happy to talk about that. And finally, just Bay du Nord, just very quickly. So this was a process or a project that went into the regulatory process over 4 years ago. It went through the existing regulatory process, and that was the previous government's regulatory process, but it included the additional principles that this government put into place as it worked through the development of what was Bill C-69 and then became the Impact Assessment Act. And that included things like projects to survive have to be net zero by 2050. This project, as you know, the Impact Assessment Agency is a quasi-independent agency that does this assessment and makes a recommendation to the Minister of Environment. And that agency recommended that this project cause no significant adverse environmental impacts and recommended that it be approved. Now, it would be highly unusual for the Minister of Environment to overrule the agency. It's legal, but it's highly unusual. And there would have to be a legal basis for that. And I would tell you that if after 4 years of proceeding through that process, the Minister of the Environment took a position that was not grounded on fact or was not grounded on things that were required through the process, it would create enormous uncertainty with respect to investment in this country, in anything, including critical minerals and everything else. So that's sort of the process piece. But I would also say with respect to this project, one of the things that seems to have been lost in some of the conversations is the absolute emissions from this project are 0.2 of a megaton. That is lower than almost any industrial facility that we have in Canada, far lower than a steel plant, far lower than an aluminum plant, far lower than most cement plants. It is the lowest emissions intensity project perhaps in the entire world, and certainly the lowest emissions intensity project in Canada. And it is required to be net zero by 2050. These are exactly the kinds of barrels of oil that the world is going to need as we actually move towards a net zero future by 2050. It will also come on stream at a time where 2 other offshore projects in Newfoundland are planned to come off stream. And so in some respects, it's replacement of oil that Newfoundland produces. But I think the other thing is, and Newfoundland and Labrador are very much aware of this, is they need to think of a future in which the production of oil is going to be a far less significant part of their economy. And one of the announcements that was made before the Bay du Nord project by myself and the minister in Newfoundland was a repurposing of the offshore board to essentially encompass renewable energy. So focusing on things like offshore wind and hydrogen. That is something that we are also working on with Nova Scotia to try to actually change the nature of the conversation that those boards are having to pivot towards some of the economic opportunity areas that will be bigger drivers of growth in a lower carbon future. So with that, I am happy to stop and answer any questions folks may have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You did cover a lot of ground.